to our February 4th Bible study. Last week, we spent virtually the whole time talking about the dealer's century and what implications it might have. And since that time, I've listened to a lot of different people talk about it. And there's different viewpoints, some being positive, some being not so positive. And Aggie the other day sent me a link to a guy by the name of J.D. Farag, who I've listened to in the past, and I listened to him. He is not particularly positive about what's happened. And I think on the positive side of the peace initiative that President Trump and Kushner and others have put forth is the fact that he is ensuring Israel's security, which is a very positive thing. He will not allow or back the formation of a new Palestinian state unless the so-called Palestinians give up, allow or agree that Israel has a right to exist and give up the terror and so on and so forth. On the other side of that, of course, the Palestinians have flatly rejected it, and so it remains to be seen if they will get on board. There are other Arab nations, I think, for the first time, that seem to be in favor of it and may put some additional pressure on them to do it. But I just want to go over some things because I still contend that even though we should be thankful that President Bush has done what he did, or President Trump has done what he's done for Israel. It's non-negotiable from what I can see in God's word about dividing the land, and that is that no one has a right to divide that land. It's already been divided, as we've noted, and one thing that was pointed out yesterday in one of the presentations I was listening to, if you were to compare Israel, it's kind of like this half of your finger. That represents Israel. In the Arab land is everything behind it. It's this entire wall. It's one tiny little piece of real estate that these people could go to. There's so much territory and land over there that could accommodate a new state, but yet it's got to be in the territory that's currently occupied by Israel. So just a couple of quick facts that I just want to point out about this whole Palestinian issue. We've talked a little bit about it in the past, but the term Palestinian, Palestine, I'm not sure if everybody understands where that came from. But in AD 135, there was a revolt. Rome, of course, was in charge of, was the empire that was the world empire at the time. They had control of Israel. There was a revolution attempted by certain Jews that had survived the AD 70 attack, which is when the Second Temple was destroyed. And this revolution took about 5 years to quash, but finally the Romans did. And the emperor at that time was a guy by the name of Hadrian, and he hated the Jewish people. And so what he did was he named or renamed Jerusalem Palestina, which was the translation at the time for Israel's archenemy, the Philistines. So it was labeled Palestina in response to Hadrian's hatred for the Jewish people. It was clearly a pejorative. It was meant to make things worse, with nothing positive about it. And that land was called Palestine and remained Palestine until 1948, when, of course, Israel became a nation. Unfortunately, and even in the church today, there are those who refer to it as Palestine, including Israel. And that is something that I think is, it's just become kind of the norm, if you will, to call it Palestine, but really it's a pejorative. It makes things worse. It is not really what it's intended to be. And there has never been an indigenous, unique Palestinian people. Yasser Arafat, who was, he's long since passed away, but he was an Egyptian. He was born in Egypt, and he claimed and maintained that he was a Palestinian. For a period of time, he claimed that he was born and raised in a house right out early 1900s. The term Palestine always represented the Jewish people, those Jews that were there at the time. For example, there was the Palestinian Symphony, which was a group of Jewish people that formed this symphony in Israel. The Palestinians really, even though they're welcome there, and I was listening to a presentation just the other day, PragerU, if anybody's heard that, but a fellow talking about the people that live in Israel. And if you go over there and pay attention, they're all different races, all different cultures, all different colors. There's a mix. Everybody is accepted. But that's not the case in the Palestinian territories. So the term Palestine is one that really I think ought to, I mean, there's nothing we can do about it, but I'm not sure it's helpful to refer to it as Palestine, but that's what's happened. Just by way of history, if you remember back in 1993, the Oslo Accords were agreed upon. Well, they were presented. They were presented at Camp David with Arafat, President Clinton, and Yitzhak Rabin, who was then Prime Minister of Israel. And then Ehud Barak came along later. And at that time, the Israelis promised or guaranteed 75% of all the promises that were, or of all the demands made by the Palestinians, including that they would return the territory back to the pre-1967 borders, which, if you remember the Six-Day War in 1967, that's when Israel took back, for the first time in history, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. Prior to the Six-Day War, they didn't have those. So they annexed those as a result of the war. And so during this peace initiative, the Israelis agreed to return all of that land to the Palestinians, the so-called Palestinians or Arabs, whatever you want to call them. Not only that, but they agreed to turn over East Jerusalem, which is the site of the Temple Mount, to Palestinian control, which, you think about that today, really made no sense. But Israel at that time was in a tough way, and they were just trying to do everything they could to appease not just their enemies, but the world as in general. And surprisingly, or not surprising, I guess depending on your point of view, Arafat stormed out of the meeting and refused to accept any of it, and in fact started what they call an uprising or an intifada, which resulted in the death of 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis or 1,000 Jews. You remember the buses being blown up and all the other things that were taking place at that time. And so what that says is that the Palestinians or the Arabs were not in the least bit interested in a deal that allowed for an independent state with Jerusalem as the capital. So they're never going to be satisfied until they get all of it. So they want the destruction of Israel. And as far as the current leadership of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas and so forth, that mindset still exists today. Interestingly, Al-Quds is the name that the Muslims have given to Jerusalem. And what's further interesting is that the term Al-Quds, which doesn't mean just capital, but it also means removal of all the Jews. So it has kind of a dual meaning. So this meaning, this Al-Quds having a dual meaning, it's interesting because Jerusalem is not mentioned one time in the Quran. It's not mentioned. We get a whiff of the Muslim connection to Jerusalem in some of their extra outside Quranic writings, like what's called the Hadith collection is where you find this. The Hadith collection is supposedly the sayings and deeds of Muhammad. So it's kind of a supplemental set of writings to the to the Quran. And it's there that they claim that Muhammad made a journey on the back of this steed, or this call it a horse, but it really wasn't a horse because it had the face of a peacock. And he was on the back of this thing and traveled from Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia, to Jerusalem, where he tied this thing to a post, and then he ascended up into paradise where he had a conversation with Allah. That's the connection between Islam and Jerusalem. The title they give it is Al-Aqsa, which means place of far-off worship. And so it really wasn't part and parcel to their belief, but yet in the Bible, Jerusalem, of course, is mentioned 700 to 800 times. And God clearly articulated throughout the Bible that it's his capital, it's his holy city, and he has given the right to it, to control it to the Jewish people. That's an everlasting covenant. It's not something that can ever change, in spite of what some might say, might tell you. The Muslims believe that their Messiah, the Mahdi, is going to return at some point in time, and when he does, he is going to create worldwide chaos so that the Muslims can establish what they call a caliphate, a worldwide caliphate or government, which would be Sharia law and so forth. And what's further interesting about that is Jesus is going to come back with him. And Jesus is going to say a prayer on behalf of the Mahdi. And so you talk about blasphemy. Islam is a false religion. Allah is a false god. Muhammad is a false prophet. But yet there's 1.5 billion or so people in the world that follow this. So if we go back to Genesis 3:15, we start to get an idea of what's going on between Israel and Israel's enemies. In Genesis 3:15, and in this class, for those that have been here and those that haven't, we've read this verse many, many times, but this is after Satan, in the form of the serpent, tempted Adam and Eve, and God found out about it, and God proclaimed to Satan, he said in verse 15, I, God, will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. So he says that I will put enmity between you and the woman, and I believe in some translations it says the seed of the woman. The woman can't have a seed. The seed comes from a man. And so what this is, way back in Genesis 3:15, is a prophecy that the one that would crush Satan's head, actually this is a reference to Antichrist, that Antichrist will be ultimately defeated by the son who will come through the woman. And so obviously we see throughout scriptures that the only person that was ever prophesied to come through the seed of a woman was, of course, Jesus Christ. So way back in Genesis 3:15, we see this promise of something that is really yet to come. Satan clearly did bruise Jesus's heel when he went to the cross. But Jesus, in turn, is going to crush his head ultimately and destroy him and cast him ultimately into the lake of fire where he will be spent eternally. So what we get here is the beginning of the rationale, if you will, for the hatred that the Muslims and the Arabs have, or that Satan has, for the Jewish people. Because clearly Jesus is going to come through the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then ultimately Mary. So he is going to come as the king of the Jews. And so Satan knew that. Satan knows this prophecy that his head's going to be crushed, that he is doomed, as we'll see further confirmed in in Daniel 2 and other places. And so he has been trying since this time to do everything in his power to wipe out the Jewish people.
This is also why the Muslims hate Christians.
I would say it is. Yep.
Repeat.
Right. It's why the question is this why Muslims hate Christians? And I believe the answer to that is yes. It's a deep-seated, they won't sit there and say, well, we hate Christians because of this verse in the book of Genesis, but it's a spiritual thing. We have to understand the power that is behind what's going on. This ultimate attempt to wipe out the Jewish people. You know, Haman, back in the book of Esther, tried to wipe them out. And then others, Herod, did everything he could to wipe them out. Then Hitler comes along. He did everything he could to wipe them out. Antichrist is going to come. He's going to try to wipe them out. Listen to what's going on with Iran and some of the enemies of the Jewish people today. Their desire is to drive them into the Mediterranean Sea and to wipe them out. It's satanic because Satan knows the end of the story. He knows the scriptures better than we do. And so he knows what the outcome's going to be. But as we're going to see when we get into 2 Thessalonians and some other amazing prophecies, that Jesus is going to destroy him with the breath of his mouth. And it's just, in other words, be gone. That breath means he's going to speak him out of existence at the appropriate time. And before we get there, there's a lot of things that obviously have to take place. We're not there yet. So basically, I think in terms of the peace plan, the deal of the century, I still believe that we don't have a right to tell Israel or to encourage Israel. And of course, Netanyahu he's very excited about it. But even that doesn't matter. There are no leaders, whether they're Jews or Gentiles, that have the right to divide that land. And we saw last week in the book of Joel, dividing the land is why God is going to bring judgment upon the world. So, jury's out. Now, am I glad that Donald Trump is in office? Yes. Am I glad that he has guaranteed Israel's security? Yes. Am I glad that he's acknowledged that Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel? Absolutely. But am I glad that he is offering through this plan to create a new state within the current borders of Israel? That's not good. That is not good. And how that shakes out, time will tell. A year from now, we may say, wow, look what happened because of that. And when I say what happened, again, I always go back to God's original promise to Abraham that he will bless those that bless them and curse those that curse them. And as we'll see when we go through some of the history of the Middle East and Israel, it's happened over and over and over again. So, jury's out on that. We'll have to see. Of course, the Palestinians have not agreed to it. I don't think they will, but again, we're just going to have to see how this whole thing plays out. Questions, comments on any of that?
When we heard the proposal last week from the Trump administration, as members of this class, we just knew that it couldn't be successful.
Right.
But not everyone did think that. And as offers go, it did sound like it was a step beyond the previous offers. It sounded pretty generous, right?
Right.
But it wasn't really a surprise later than the next day when I heard President Abbas, I forgot, these aren't exactly his words, and I didn't remember his whole comment, but basically he ended by saying, because that Jerusalem was not to be given any of it to the Palestinians.
Right.
So he said, after hearing that offer, that he wouldn't allow his legacy to be said that he sold Jerusalem.
Right.
For money or
Yeah.
something like
Right.
that.
Right.
That's how he perceived it.
Yes.
Which is the same way as what you're describing in Genesis almost. This isn't a little thing, a matter of bargaining.
No, this
Maybe
is,
it was a better offer, maybe I'll go for it.
right.
There's no solution to it.
There is no solution. The point that was made here, for those that may be listening, is that last week we all agreed that it wasn't going to work, and that Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, said that he was not going to approve and destroy his legacy by selling or giving up that land, which is consistent with so many things we read throughout God's Word. So much more to come on that. It's just yet one more example, one more piece to the puzzle. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, how do you know we're in the end times? Well, we know we're in the end times because so many things that have been prophesied for the return of Christ have either taken place, are in the process of taking place, and if they've taken place and we have the evidence of fulfilled prophecy, some of which we'll talk about, then we know that what is yet to take place has to. It has to take place exactly like he said. So there will be a tribulation. There will be a rapture of the church. Jesus is going to return with millions of believers. A couple of articles. One I came across here, and I'll just read a couple of highlights, and that the title of this is How Trump's Peace Plan Has Moved the Baseline. And I'll just read a couple of highlights. Almost every U.S. administration has come up with a peace plan, and they all have one thing in common: failure. The Trump plan will suffer the same fate. Still, it may be valuable by setting new baselines for negotiations that are in Israel's favor. So that's a positive, that he's taken a different stance and he's coming at it from a different direction, largely in support of Israel. Why will the plan fail? The Palestinians have had nothing to do with the U.S. administration and will reject the plan out of hand, and at least that's what they've said so far. We also know from history that no plan will satisfy the current Palestinian leadership and that Hamas is committed to Israel's destruction. So Hamas is the terrorist group that currently occupies Gaza, which is part of this new state. And they are funded and under the control of Iran, which is another interesting aspect. And Hamas, there's the Palestinian Charter, which essentially is the Palestinian Charter, which was developed by Arafat, still in existence today. You don't see any reference to Israel in it whatsoever. And the same with the Hamas Charter. They both completely ignore Israel altogether. In fact, if you look at any map, primarily in the Palestinian territory, but much of the Arab world, you won't see Israel on the map. You'll see it, but it's called Palestine. So there's really doesn't seem to be a whole lot of interest. The baseline shifted when Prime Minister Ehud Barak agreed to the Clinton parameters and accepted the ideas of dividing Jerusalem, which that was just a huge mistake. And of course, that was along those lines that resulted in Rabin being assassinated, conceding most of the West Bank and establishing a Palestinian state. Then Ehud Olmert picked up on the plan with minor variations, but in both instances, the Palestinians again rejected the offers. And what they're saying here is that Israel promised them virtually everything they asked for. They agreed to it. But even so, they were never accepted. Once Israelis saw that Yasser Arafat would not accept a deal that offered nearly everything he said he wanted, ignoring what he told his constituents in Arabic, namely that this was the first stage toward the liberation of Palestine and that the Palestinians should engage in a jihad, they moved rightward. So it goes on to say Barack Obama dramatically shifted the baseline of negotiations when he pressured Israel to accept a settlement freeze. Now, this is in the West Bank, which is in the land, clearly within the borders, the boundaries of the land that God gave to the Jewish people. The settlements are in places like Hebron and other places where God clearly said to Abraham and his descendants, I give this land to you as an everlasting covenant, promise. To accept a settlement free, something the Palestinians had never even demanded, and like others, endorsed the creation of a Palestinian state. And I say, unfortunately, here we go again with another proposal for a new state of Palestine. Of course, it's going to take 4 years, allegedly, before the world or the United States or whomever, Israel, agrees that the Palestinians will have met all the demands that are part of the plan. So even so, the Palestinians still refuse to negotiate. Trump is recalibrating expectations again. By recognizing Jerusalem, he has taken one of the most difficult final status issues off the table, which, as we'll see in a moment, is a huge bone of contention for Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, and for Iran, and all of these other nations that are so prominently mentioned in Ezekiel and other places. So it's a great move, but it's not going over well with a lot of the nations that are against Israel today. By erasing the specious argument that settlements are illegal and refusing to condemn their expansion, he has created the expectation in Israel that there will be no forced removal of tens of thousands of Jews from Judea and Samaria. So what he's saying is that no Palestinians have to be moved, and no Israelis have to be moved from the territories they currently occupy. Even the possibility of creating a Palestinian state has largely become moot, as the Palestinian public has soured on the idea, and the number of settlements has made it nearly impossible, if not impossible, to create one. So an article that dealt with this whole plan for peace. Again, as I've said, just another piece of the pie. Talking about Turkey, for those of you that haven't been in the class, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but Ezekiel 38 and 39 refers to a coming invasion or attempted invasion of Israel by a group of nations that will include Russia, Turkey, Iran, Libya, and what we know to be Sudan. Clearly mentioned, clearly identified in the 38th chapter of Ezekiel. They're going to move on Israel. Something is going to motivate them to move. We don't know what it is. It could be Israel's gas rights. It could be could be whatever. But key to that whole invasion will be Gog, who is the leader of Russia. And it's just recently that Turkey has become a very active participant in this confederacy. They're really a part of it. They hadn't been up until recently. And it's interesting that now the title of this article is Turkey Looking to Reestablish a Muslim Caliphate with Jerusalem as its capital. So you've got Jerusalem. Remember what we read in Zechariah chapter 12, that Jerusalem will become a cup of trembling, a burdensome stone for the whole world. So we've got Trump rightfully saying that Jerusalem's the undivided capital of Israel. You've got the Muslims saying it's their third holiest site, Temple Mount and East Jerusalem. You've got Turkey and Iran saying that they have no right, when they say they, the Israelis, the Jews, to Turkey whatsoever. And so it is becoming more and more hotly contested, and is determined and bound and destined to become a huge issue as time goes forward. So a lot happened in terms of Jerusalem. Again, God's holy cities. We'll see when we get to Daniel 9. God or Gabriel is sent to speak and to provide Daniel with a message. And that message is prefaced with the comment that God has established for you and your holy city. And of course, Daniel was a Jew, so it was a reference to the Jews and the Jews' holy city. So from God's perspective, Jerusalem is the holy city for Israel. not for anybody else. Okay, questions, comments? One other thing I wanted to talk about. Let's just take a quick look, if I can find this article. This is a little bit unsettling, but in Matthew 24, and then we'll come back to Daniel, I promise, right after that. Matthew chapter 24. And those that have studied prophecy at all know that Matthew 24 is kind of like a linchpin for Bible prophecy. It's where the disciples up on the Mount of Olives asked Jesus certain questions about the end of the age, and Jesus gave them some information, all of which would come to pass as we get closer to his time, to his return. But in verse 4, in response to that question, Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed." And that's I think, something that we need to bear in mind, that we shouldn't be alarmed, because as he goes on to say, all these things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, kingdoms against kingdoms. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are the beginning of birth pangs. So all of these things coming together within the same general time frame. There's always been famines, there's always been earthquakes, there's always been wars. But when you see an increase of these things within the general time frame, these are signposts. All these are signposts telling us of what's going to happen. These are the beginning, if you will, of events all combined that will come together and ultimately lead to the tribulation, because all of these things, the earthquakes and the famine and the wars and the rumor of wars, come to their apex in Revelation chapter 6 and beyond. So we're seeing these signposts come together. And then Jesus says something very interesting in verse 8, where he says, all these things are the beginning of birth pangs. And for those that haven't been with us before, what that simply means is when you see all these things start and begin, understand that as time goes on, they're only going to become more intense and more frequent. Just the same as when a woman goes into labor. As she gets, further into it, the pains are more intense and more frequent. And so that's the analogy that Jesus uses here. So famine is one of those things that he says will increase. And of course, we talked within the last couple of weeks about the numbers of earthquakes and volcanoes and the seismic activity that is unprecedented that we've seen throughout the world in just the last couple of years. But here's something that I wasn't aware of, but it has to do with East Africa. And it's billions of locusts are eating everything in sight in East Africa right now. And every single day, many more farms are being completely wiped out. Unfortunately, authorities are telling us that what we have seen so far is just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, if extreme measures are not implemented immediately, authorities are claiming that this locust plague could literally get 500 times worse in a few months. But it's difficult to imagine conditions getting any worse than they are at this moment. Ravenous locust swarms that are the size of cities are consuming crops at a staggering pace, and this could potentially cause famine on the African continent that is unlike anything we have ever seen before. It can be difficult to imagine a plague of billions of locusts. Right now, billions of locusts are absolutely devastating East Africa. Did anybody know that? Heard about that? No. Yeah. Pardon me? Yeah. Yeah. And each one can eat its own weight in food every day. Billions of locusts, and there's photos. I mean, this isn't just something made up. You can actually see photos, real-time photos of these things. Billions of locusts swarming through East Africa could prove disastrous for a region still reeling from drought and deadly floods, experts have warned amid increasing calls for international help. Dense clouds of the ravenous insects, each of which consumes its own weight in food every day, has spread from Ethiopia and Somalia into Kenya in the region's worst infestation in decades. It would be hard to overstate what this is going to mean for the region. According to the FAO, this plague is an unprecedented threat to food security and livelihoods in the Horn of Africa. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization has described the situation as, quote, extremely alarming, representing, quote, an unprecedented threat to food security and livelihoods in the Horn of Africa. But if the plague continues to get even worse, the stage is being set for a famine that is far greater than anything any of us have ever witnessed. The density of some of these locust swarms is absolutely crazy. According to officials, a single locust swarm can have up to 150 million locusts per square kilometer. A typical desert locust swarm can contain up to 150 million locusts per kilometer. Swarms migrate with the wind and can cover 62 to 93 miles a day. An average swarm can destroy as much food crops in a day as is sufficient to feed 2,500 people. So this is just one more example, I believe, of things that are happening. Obviously, when we think in terms of Bible prophecy, we like to think about what's going on in our country in the United States. But this tribulation that's coming and all the events that Jesus warned about are worldwide. These are things to be on the lookout for throughout the world.
Even the virus, the coronavirus.
The virus, yep, that's another potential plague. I think I'm hearing that it could be, or maybe already is, a pandemic. It doesn't seem to be a lot of concern about this country, but it's certainly having an impact in China. So one more thing.
About that, in my Bible where it says there will be famines and earthquakes, there's a note that says other manuscripts say epidemics.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And again, these things are just going to get worse and worse and worse. And again, have there always been famines? Yes. But when you consider something of this magnitude, along with all of the other warnings that Jesus talked about, and the things that are going to happen, to say nothing of what's going on in the Middle East and culturally and throughout the world, and the divisions, we won't even get into that right now, or the deception. There's a lot of books being written by well-meaning, one of which is a guy named Michael Youssef. Anybody familiar with him? He's got a new book coming out, I believe, and he's very, very well-known and has a worldwide ministry. But he's got a book coming out, I think it's called Saving Christianity or something. I'm not exactly, it's going to be out the next couple of weeks. And it has to do with all the false teachings that are out there in the church. And it can be something as benign or as simple as taking a verse in the Bible and twisting it or turning it to mean something other than what it says. For example, I think it was the Church of England just came out and apologized for taking the position that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's a church apologizing for what God has clearly ordained. So there's just all of these things that are taking place. Okay, you ready to get into Daniel? All right, let's move there. And for those that are out there listening, is that it?
If you notice, Marilyn Cagle said hello.
Oh, hey, Marilyn. Okay, I'm putting up, for those that are looking in, if you haven't already printed it off, I don't know if we can make that bigger or not, but.
No, that's what we got. Hold on.
Oh, okay. This is a chart that I want to just take a quick look at as we introduce a couple of chapters we're going to go over in the book of Daniel. It's a very busy chart. The font is very small, but I think it gives us a pretty good idea, and it's very accurate from what I know about what this is history in advance. So Daniel, we have to go all the way back to the left side of this chart where we see this figure of this man, this statue, if you will, with the gold head and gold helmet and so forth. But and we'll go through and look at some of these things in the book of Daniel in a minute. But what we see here is prophecies that relate to the coming world empires, or coming empires that would rule the world. And so when we get into Daniel chapter 2 and then again Daniel chapter 7, I think it's interesting, and it'll probably make a little more sense when we actually read it, that when Daniel is given the image, or he's asked to interpret what this statue means, as it is articulated in chapter 2, he identifies various empires that would come. At the time Daniel's given this prophecy, he is in the he's in the Babylonian Empire, or the time of the Babylonians. And of course, as we know through history, empires came and went. And so what we have here is Babylon that was ultimately replaced or defeated by the Medo-Persian Empire, that was ultimately defeated by the Greek Empire, that was ultimately defeated by Rome. And then we have a remnant, which we'll talk about, of another empire yet to come. And so Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, which again, we'll get to that in just a moment, that this statue, that the head of gold represents Babylon, but that Babylon would be defeated by the Medo-Persian Empire some 50 years after I'm saying 50 years, give or take, after he's given this message by God. And then he says that Babylon will be replaced by the Medo-Persian Empire, and that 218 years later, they would be defeated or overtaken by Greece. So in other words, Jerusalem, Israel, at first was a part of the Babylonian Empire, then Babylon was defeated by the Mede-Persian Empire, so Israel was under the control of the Medes and the Persians. They were defeated by the Greeks, and then ultimately the Romans. And so what we have here is a 480 or so year period of time into the future. And so Daniel, being the faithful prophet that he was, foresees all of these things in advance. And we have the benefit of looking back to say, oh yeah, that's exactly what happened. So Daniel could not have foreseen or known that there would be a Mede-Persian Empire when he got when he was told by God that it was going to replace Babylon and so forth. So it's kind of a history in advance. As we go through Daniel, we'll see that for the first 6 chapters, it's all about history. And what's interesting in the first 6 chapters of Daniel is that they were written in Aramaic, which is represents, it deals with Gentile nations. But then when we get to chapter 12, or chapter 7 through chapter 12, it's written in Hebrew. And so 7 through 12 are all prophetic and back dealing with the nation of Israel. So what we have here are, in fact, one of the chapters, chapter 4, was actually written by a Gentile. Nebuchadnezzar is the author of Daniel chapter 4. And so the first 6 chapters are all about Gentiles and history, written in Aramaic, and then interestingly changes to Hebrew from 7 to the end when we get back into Israel. So let's take a look at Luke, if we could, before we get back into Daniel. And if not, any of these things don't make sense, just stop me. But in Luke 21,
Wait, that's one of the chapters written by Daniel?
yes. Yeah. Luke 21, and, let's see, what verse is that? Talking about the times of the gym. Okay, so Luke 21, over in verse 24. Again, Luke 21 is also a summary, if you will, of what Jesus told the apostles up on the Mount of Olives. Some different information, but basically the same what we read in Matthew 24. And so Jesus says in Luke 21:24, they, being Israel and the Gentiles, will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all nations. So that's a reference to the Jewish people, and they were taken after, and this is a prophecy for the destruction of the Jewish temple, which took place roughly 37 years after this was given in 70 AD, that Jesus had prophesied way back at the beginning that the temple, which Herod had basically retrofitted, it was considered one of the wonders of the world, and the apostles were marveling at the temple, and Jesus said, hey, guess what? There's coming a time when this temple is going to be destroyed and not one stone will be left on another. It's exactly what happened in AD 70, and it was at that point, actually it began before then, when Jerusalem was under the control of Gentile nations. But then he goes on to say, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. As we get into Daniel, we'll see exactly what that means. Now, a lot of people will tell you that what happened in 1967, which was the Six-Day War, when for the first time in 2,500 years, the Jews took control. They didn't have control before this. They took control of East Jerusalem for the first time in 2,600 years. So now they have total control over Jerusalem and have had since 1967. Some would say that fulfilled this prophecy for the times of the Gentiles, but it says that Jerusalem will be trampled on by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. We're going to see that time takes place when Jesus returns. And so while Israel does today have control of Jerusalem, at least as things sit today, the time of the Gentiles is not yet expired. Okay? So now if we go back to the book of Daniel, and Daniel is, I just have, you could spend a lifetime studying Daniel, and every time you read it, you just have to marvel at what is happening and what is stated here. It's the most, it's full of more prophecies, I believe, than any other book in the Bible. And it's the most documented book. It's so full of fulfilled prophecy as evidenced by history that many have said that it had to have been written after the events took place as opposed to before. Like this, what we just talked about with the statue in chapter 2, that the only way Daniel could have known that would have been if he wrote it, 500 years, or somebody wrote it 500 years after it happened. But it has been documented through a number of different means, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and just the detail contained within the book of Daniel that these things, in fact, were written and recorded well before they took place. And so let's just, you don't have to go there. I just want to read a pretty familiar verse from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 46. We've read this before. Remember this, fix it in mind, take it to heart, you rebels. And this is God speaking. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say my purpose will stand and I will do all that I please. And so what he's saying here is that, hey, I'm sovereign, and all of these things are going to take place, but he's also saying that I make known things that are going to happen in the future. And Jesus says later in John 5 that I tell you these things ahead of time so that you will believe. And when you see them come into be fulfilled, you know that I've done it. And so what we have here is God saying, I'm going to lay out the end from the beginning. I'm going to tell you before. And so fulfilled prophecy turns out to be one of the greatest evidences there is that the Bible's true. If we know that all these things that were prophesied ahead of time took place precisely as the Bible laid out, then okay, end of conversation. It has to be true. So what we have here, and I'm not going to spend much time on.
What are the times of the Gentiles? What does that mean?
Means that it's under the control of the Gentiles before the Jews. Yeah, what does the time of the Gentiles mean? It means that the Jew or the Gentiles basically have control and are trying to, like the Arabs are Gentiles. Everything other than Jews are Gentiles. So it's controlling, or those that control Jerusalem.
And you think that's going to happen until Jesus comes back?
Right. Right now they have control. But as we'll see as we get into the tribulation and going forward, that Jerusalem is going to be overtaken again by Antichrist and his armies. So the times of the Gentiles has not yet expired, but it will. So chapter 1, what we have here is kind of an overview of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the leader of Babylon. And what's interesting is if you go to the book of Jeremiah in chapter 25, God prophesies that because of Israel's failure to obey his commands and decrees, most notably allowing the land of Israel to lie fallow every 7 years, and they did this for a period of 490 years without doing so, that God was going to have the Jews taken into captivity in Babylon for a period of 70 years. So they are now under Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has attacked Jerusalem. He has taken back to Babylon a number of the brightest and smartest of the Jewish people, including Daniel, Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, and so forth. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which became their names along with Daniel. And the purpose was to bring them back and to train them in the ways of the Babylonians so that they could become leaders. And as we see in chapter 1, Daniel's name was changed to Belteshazzar, Hananiah was changed to Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah to Abednego, all representing certain Babylonian gods and figures. So, and then we see in Daniel 1 that Daniel and his friends refused to partake in the food that were being served them by the Babylonians because it violated what the Jewish law had commanded. So, real quick background there now. In chapter 2, and we've got just a few minutes here, we'll get back to this next week, but I want to just kind of provide a very high level overview to think about as we get into the book of Daniel. We'll come back to this next week. But in Daniel chapter 2, verse 29, what had happened was that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had a dream. And this dream included this statue, which is depicted on this chart. And the statue bothered him. He didn't know what it meant. And none of his astrologers or any of the sorcerers or whatever that were part of Babylon could interpret it. But Daniel could, because God told him exactly what this image meant. And so in verse 29, Well, let's just actually go to 27. Daniel replied, so now Daniel has come forward. Nebuchadnezzar had threatened to kill all of the astrologers and wise men of Babylon because they couldn't interpret it. Daniel comes forward and says, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar is the one that saw this image, what will happen in the days to come. So this is what the world can look forward to. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you lay in bed are these. So picture this. This is Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. Daniel interprets it before Mede, Persia, Greece, Rome, and so forth come into play. Long before. And so he goes on to say, as you were lying there, king, O king, your mind turned to things to come. In other words, in the future. You were seeing things that are going to take place. And the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. Now, it's interesting that in Jeremiah, Nebuchadnezzar, while he's a pagan at this point in time, was referred to as a servant of God. And he ultimately goes through some pretty rough times, but he will ultimately, and I think we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. He ultimately has an experience with God. So what is going to happen? As for me, this mystery has been revealed to Daniel. To me, not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold. Its chest and arms were silver, its belly and thighs of bronze. So what we see here is decreasing value of these metals as you go down the statue. Its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, and listen to this, we're just going to finish on this because we're a minute over now. But what we see here is a vision of the empires to come. And all the way down through the legs, the feet, and the toes. The 10 toes represent an empire, if you will, yet to come. We'll see a clarification of that in Daniel 7. Out of the empire that's yet to come, what often is referred to as the revived Roman Empire, will come Antichrist. He is going to come from the remnant or what's left of the Roman Empire, because if you go through history, you'll see that the Mede-Persians defeated Babylon, and then the Greeks defeated the Mede-Persians, and the Romans defeated Greece, but nobody ever defeated Rome. It just kind of collapsed, and it's just kind of been lying there, the remnants of it, ever since it collapsed in 400 or 500 AD. And so people have been trying to rebuild it, but we'll finish with this. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, let's see here. A rock was cut out, but not by human hands. So a rock generally or often symbolizes God, symbolizes Jesus Christ. And unfortunately, I don't know if you remember the verse in Matthew where Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church. And the Roman Catholics have taken that to mean that he was referring to Peter as the rock. Well, that's not the case. He was referring to himself. Upon this rock, I will build my church. He wasn't going to build his church on a fallible human being, but that's another story. Remember that. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on his feet of iron and clay and smashed them. The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken into pieces. At the same time, it became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. So, what we have here is a vision of this image being struck by this rock at its feet, and all of it just kind of collapsing down and shattering and being blown to the four corners of the earth. What that represents are the remnants of all those empires, the institutions, the governments, the leaders of all these false governments and empires are just suddenly going to be crushed by the rock, who's Jesus Christ. That's what's going to happen during the tribulation. At the end of the tribulation, he is going to come back and shatter, and we'll see that confirmed later in chapter 7 and in Revelation, that Jesus will come back, destroy these empires, and he himself will replace it and become a huge mountain that fills the whole earth, which just simply means that Jesus is going to rule the earth by himself. He's not going to need, thank the Lord, thank him, he's not going to need the United States Congress to help him. I mean, thankfully, he's going to rule and reign. He's going to sit upon the throne of his father David. He's going to rule and reign in perfect righteousness. That's what it means when it says the rock's going to come, destroy all these institutions, and replace them with himself. And he is going to become a huge mountain, or the ruler that is going to fill the whole earth. Well, that's just kind of an introduction, and man, that's mind-blowing to think that way back in Daniel 500 BC, we have this image of these empires being destroyed by Jesus, and then Jesus taking the place of the leaders of these various empires that are the remnants of all these different nations or empires, and the one to come. Questions? More to come next week.
Are we gonna have to deal with the locusts?
Well, I don't know, Darcy. I don't think here that that somehow.
Yeah, I don't think so.
So for those of you out there, we'll see you next week, hopefully. And